Welcome to the Resilience Cafe. The Resilience Cafes are sponsored by the West Kootenay Climate Hub, located in beautiful British Columbia. This second episode features Kelpie Wilson and Greg Utzig, speaking about soil health, climate, and local resilience. Kelpie Wilson is founder of Wilson Biochar Associates and a mechanical engineer, writer, and consultant with a background in renewable energy and forest protection. Currently, she specializes in biochar technology and market development. Be sure to check out her awesome Biochar Prepper Substack. There's workshops, videos, and more there. Greg Utzig. Much of what we know about landscapes in the Kootenay region can be traced back to Greg. For the past 40 years, Greg has been at the center of landscape analysis for land use planning, climate modeling, watershed and habitat analysis, forest management, biodiversity protection, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. In the last Resilience Cafe, Selkirk College researcher Jamie Jones introduced us to the Cynefin framework, which can help us distinguish between complicated and complex problems. Why is this important? For one reason, because we humans are currently faced with navigating extremely complex social, emotional, economic, political, and ecological challenges. I think we all feel that, right? It's extremely taxing for our consciousnesses and our nervous systems to be faced with this disorienting lack of a sense of concrete knowing. But here's the thing. Just because we need to have some grasp of complexity doesn't mean we want to get lost in complexity, right? We need to learn how to navigate this world between worlds, or as it's called, this liminal space. And so here's where two very important concepts from systems theory come into play: emergence and attractors. And I'm going to just read from Wikipedia here. Emergence in philosophy, systems theory, science, and art, emergence occurs when a complex entity has properties or behaviors that its parts do not have on their own, and emerge only when they interact in a wider whole. So think about dynamic, complex systems like an economy, a society, an ecology, a political system, a cell, or your brain. Remember that what emerges in complex systems, as we learned at the last webinar, is unpredictable and nonlinear. So it's entirely likely that when we're dealing with a challenge, like say the climate crisis, there are all kinds of issues and hopefully ways to meet this challenge that we don't even know about yet. And this is where attractors come in. An attractor is a pattern or equilibrium that under certain circumstances is very likely to emerge and stabilize within a dynamical system, such as a society. For our purposes in this complex time of globalization, digitalization, and all the resulting discontents, it might be helpful to look around us and see what attractors we think are powerful and will help us co-develop or co-create together a culture that can manage this incredible complexity. So the question I'd like to start with you both after that intro is, what attractors led you both to your interest in soil, biochar, and ecology more broadly, and what emerged for you along the way that you never could have predicted?
I have to say food. I'm very attracted to food. I think probably most of us are. And I think I went through a period of real despair around 2003, 2004. Things just weren't looking good in the world. And that's when I really started gardening in earnest. And I remember writing a piece. At that time, I was writing a regular column for an online news site. And I wrote a piece just titled, "The Green Dream is Alive." because I'd been getting my hands in the soil and planting seeds and growing food and started to have a little success with it. And I was doing it with my neighbors. So we did a garden together, and I continue to do that. The garden that I have now is shared with the next door neighbor. And it's very informal, it's just, we're just gardening together because it's so much easier to do it with someone else. And so, yeah, I guess that was the big attractor. And shortly after that is when I heard about biochar. And my first realization about biochar was that it's like permanent compost. So if you garden, every year your soil shrinks because the carbon in it gets used up, and it's mineralized, it's turned to CO2 by all the microbes in the soil. And when I kind of started realizing what biochar was, that microbes don't really eat it, it stays there. I thought, hallelujah, because as a gardener, you spend so much time making compost, hauling manure, anything you can do to get carbon back in your soil. So that's where it led me. All started with food.
Greg, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. My arrival at soil science is a bit of a roundabout, haphazard arrival. Um, I would have to say my interest in the environment and ecosystems began as I was a kid. I used to spend part of my summers in northern Wisconsin with my grandparents. Spent a lot of time in the forest, and I really got interested in how the forest worked. And eventually I went off to university, did a degree in geology, which came out of that, except that when I finished, I realized I was either going to be working for a mining company or an oil company. So I decided I wanted to do something else. I wanted to go into wildlife biology, but getting into grad school with a degree in geology and wildlife biology is complicated. And someone said to me, well, you should go halfway in between. Think about soils. And I applied to UBC and I couldn't get a position in the wildlife department, but I did get a position in the soil science department. And that led to great interest in soils. It's an incredible field to be in. And it does marry the geology and wildlife because it's halfway in between. It is the basis for most of our ecosystems. And that led to a position with the Ministry of Forests here in British Columbia, where I was in charge of developing an ecosystem classification system for southeastern BC. And many people, when they look at that, think about plants and trees. I came at it from a soil point of view. And fortunately, here in British Columbia, we have what we call the biogeoclimatic system, which marries soils and geology along with vegetation and climate to create a classification system. And so soils has always been an integral part of that. And subsequent to that, I did a lot of straight soil science. I did research on impacts of slash burning on soils, on impacts of machinery, logging on soils, as well as looking at potential impacts in terms of doing a lot of soil mapping and identifying areas that are hazardous for development to try and avoid creating erosion problems mainly, but also compaction and loss of nutrition as well. But unfortunately, about 15 years ago, I realized that climate change was going to make all that work irrelevant because the ecosystems were going to change dramatically. So after I'd spent most of my career developing a classification system for ecosystems that are not likely to persist more than a few more decades, I actually switched to concentrating almost all my work on climate change in the last decade. And that's where I'm at now.
One question that immediately comes to mind is how do soil health and climate relate? And it is a two-way street, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty big topic. When you're talking about marrying soils or geology and wildlife, I thought of the term geobotany. Where I live is in the Klamath floristic province, you would call it. And it's a really interesting geology because it's a mix of serpentine, from ocean terrains that glom up against the continental shelf, and then just to the east of us is the Cascade Range and the Sierras. And so this is called the Klamath Knot because it's where all these geo regions come together. And so we have incredible diversity, mainly botanical diversity. And so, before I got involved in biochar in the 90s, I was running a forest protection group here called the Siskiyou Regional Education Project. And that's why I came here, because I fell in love with forests, same thing. And I think, I talked about going through that period of despair at around 2003, 2004. This was after we'd had a huge mega fire here called the Biscuit Fire, 500,000 acres in the Kalmiopsis Wilderness, which was my playground. And it's just burnt sticks, and it was incredibly wrenching to experience that. And and now watching how it's recovering, or evolving now for almost 20, more than 20 years. It's really interesting, and you just have to kind of step back, I think, and try to take a deep time perspective. The geology is the basis. What's going to evolve out of that? Rising temperatures is one thing. Um, Weather patterns, rainfall patterns. I see also a lot of the impacts really are coming about because of lack of fire suppression. So that'd be my question for you, Greg. Is your area a fire adapted forest? Or I don't really know much about the Kootenai.
Um,
Is fire naturally a part of the forest there, or not?
it's Fire is definitely a natural part of the forest. However, the Kootenays, because of we're kind of in the transition zone between the Pacific coastal climate and the continental climate on the other side of the Rockies. So we have a tremendous amount of influence by weather systems that move in off the coast
Mhm.
and bump up against the mountains. When they rise, of course, they dump. So we have wetter areas where that's happening. And then once you get into a rain shadow, you go to the opposite, which is where we have our more fire controlled ecosystems. But I would say it's a mix of both. I mean, fire is definitely affected, but in the drier parts of our region, we're talking about under a natural system, you probably had a low intensity fire every 50 years, and you had very open stands of trees with grasslands and shrubs underneath, and there were species that were able to be adapted to that kind of environment. But when you went up in elevation, the fire frequency was much less, and in some cases, as long as 500 to 1,000 years in the northern part of the Kootenays, in which case you've got old growth forests and fire hasn't occurred. Well, when we were doing the biogeoclimatic mapping, there was one region in the Kootenays where we could not find any stands that were less than 250 years old, except along the railroad where they burned when they built the railroad. Whereas other places, there were stands of various ages because there was a more frequent fire situation. But what's happened over the past decades, in the 1920s and 30s, the Dust Bowl days, definitely when you look at climate data, it was warmer and drier here as well. And there were more fires during that period, more than there have been in the more recent decades. But some of the firework we've done here, we found that in the middle of the last century, summer precip increased by almost 50% on average, and the amount of fire that occurred was reduced substantially. People like to say that it's due to increased fire control and fire management, which they've contributed, but the big fires aren't put out by firefighters, they're put out by rain.
Mhm.
And so during that period, a lot of these areas increased in density of vegetation. And now we've got areas that are overstocked and, in fact, very fire prone. And so when we get a fire now, when we would have had that kind of low intensity fire, we get a very high intensity ground fire. And we've had some fairly large disasters in recent years.
And would you say that's because of the hotter temperature or drier conditions? Or, I mean, how much of that is you don't think much of that is due to fire suppression, the overstocked um
it's
circumstance.
blamed on that, but when I look at the climate data, I think it's a rather minor effect. I think the climate itself was a major contributor.
Mhm,
But in some cases, I mean, we definitely put out a lot of small fires, and
mhm.
that maybe means we don't get as many big fires, but we don't put out big fires.
Oh,
That
yeah,
doesn't happen.
no.
So I think they're both contributing factors.
Mhm,
Um, but there's no question the climate data says that the climate had changed and now it's changing again. And now, in fact, it is getting warmer and the summers are getting drier. And we're going back to the climate of the 2030s. And with climate projections, within 2 or 3 more decades, we'll be beyond what was happening in the 20s and 30s.
mhm,
And most of the work that I've been doing in the last few months has been looking at a factor which I'm sure you've heard of down there is this whole question of vapor pressure deficits. And that
mhm,
is, as you increase the temperature, the amount of moisture the atmosphere can hold, it increases by 7% by every degree you increase the temperature, every degree Celsius.
mhm.
And of course, that means not only that we get these high intensity rainstorms because the atmosphere can hold more moisture, but at the same time, it means the moisture has a capability of sucking moisture out of everything, including living plants and forest fuels. And these increases in vapor pressure are very much correlated with the amount of area burned. There's been quite a few studies in the States that have looked at that correlation. And I think that increasing temperature, regardless of what's happening at precipitation, is a main driver.
Yeah, I just learned about that. It's really fascinating, and I've learned about it in the context of the small water cycle. And I don't know if you know, have heard of Alpha Low and the water stories.
I have seen that,
Right.
yes.
And that there are some projects, I think Slovakia is one place where they're doing this, where they're basically trying to increase rainfall in a more even pattern. So instead of having, this all the moisture getting sucked out of one area and then completely dumped, in another area, just to restore the small water cycle. And this is really dependent on vegetative cover. So you have the transpiration because you don't get condensation, nucleation, and condensation to make clouds without vegetative cover. And so the more vegetation you have, the more seeding you get to make rainfall, as I understand it. And that's, to me, amazing because that's something we could actually do something about, is to revegetate where we have so much bare soil.
Yeah,
Really
that's not a,
quickly,
go ahead.
because people are here about the soil. I don't want to be sure we touch on mulch and biochar because I know you're both excited about mulch or not excited about it, and of course to introduce people to biochar, Kelpie.
Yeah,
Well,
that'd
but
be great.
can I hear what Greg has to say about the small water cycle first? Because it's all
Sure.
related to soil. It's dry soil that's causing the problem as I see it.
Yeah, it, I agree. Dry soil is not an issue here because basically we don't have hardly any bare soil. The only bare soil we have is in industrial sites.
Right.
Um, just because there's sufficient moisture, there has been in the historical past.
Mhm.
Um, but what am very concerned about, I'll just go, I hate to keep going on this thing about vapor pressure, but vapor pressure deficit is what drives transpiration, which is what you're talking about returning this up, this. But there was a recent study done in your region actually looking at Douglas fir and increasing vapor pressure deficit. And what they found was that even though there was moisture in the soil, the trees were not able to actually use it. And what
Mm.
happens is that once the vapor pressure deficit becomes sufficiently high, the plants can't move the water through their xylem, or the trees can't move it through their xylem and up to the leaves fast enough. So if they don't keep up, they create an embolism and the xylem tubes become blocked. It's like an embolism in your blood system. Once you get a bubble in there, you're done.
Mm.
So the plants are adapted to try and avoid that. So what do? They close their stomata and they stop photosynthesizing and they stop transpiring. So in fact, that moisture is not being moved by the plants when the vapor pressure deficit goes beyond a critical threshold. And every plant's got a different threshold, but they all have a threshold.
Mhm.
And so if we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and we keep raising the temperature, those kind of practical solutions will become impractical and impossible. So we really need to deal with the base of the problem. Short term, yes. Long term, no.
Which you have made the point that this is why it's so important that there's collective action, that it's not just, and that we really get on the emissions
Yeah.
sooner, well, yesterday or 10 years ago or what have you.
But I really appreciate what Kelpie has been doing, and I found looking at some of her work very interesting because the kinds of things that I'm enthused about are things that adapt to climate change, but at the same time provide some kind of sequestration or a reduction in greenhouse gases. So I think biochar is a good example of that. It can be tied to doing adaptation in the sense of doing thinning and reducing forest fuels, but at the same time sequestering some of that carbon rather than just burning it. So I think it's a perfect example of that combination that's really important these days.
Kelpie, can you give us 2 minutes on biochar? Because we're about.
Yeah, sure. So if you grow a tree and a tree takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to build its tissues. And so now you've got a piece of wood, the tree died, or you had to cut it to thin it because there were too many trees. And that wood has about 50% of the material in that wood is carbon. And if you burn it to ash, which we are always doing, as part of our fuels projects, got to get rid of it because it's a fire danger. We burn it to ash, all that carbon goes back up into the atmosphere. Same if we just leave it on the ground and it rots, and bugs eat it, and it eventually takes longer, but it goes back to the atmosphere. So biochar is an intervention in that cycle. And so there's many ways of making biochar. I'm a real big advocate for the simple ways of making it on site. Although, there's certainly other legitimate ways to make it, but especially with these forest fuels that are way out deep in the woods, far away from any industrial facility. By the time you transport it to to town, where you could put it into an industrial facility, you've already burned up a lot of fossil fuels to do that, and so forth and so on. So anyway, there's all this material out there. We're burning it to ash, putting the carbon back in the atmosphere. If you do some of the techniques that I've been using, and we could do this just in a regular burn pile, you can sequester up to half of the carbon in the wood as biochar. Some of it's still going to go back as CO2 because it's basically, if you have a piece of wood, you're going to burn away half of it to create the heat to char the rest of it. So, so anyway, that's not a bad way to go. And there's other advantages too, because you, by doing this, instead of burning it to ash, you don't create a burn scar in the forest soil. And that can be pretty significant. So, yeah, it works pretty well. And what we found is those places where we leave a pile of char rather than a burn scar of mineral soil. If it's just mineral soil, that's when the invasives come in. You'll get thistles and weeds. They like that kind of environment. Your native plants don't regenerate very easily. But if we have char there, it holds water for one thing. And then you haven't, I've found green fir needles underneath a pile of char that we put out with water. So it doesn't burn the soil. You save the organic soil. And you've got this little layer of char there that holds water. And so, the native plants can come back easily. And in fact, we've done some kind of experiments where we seeded with a native seed mix in those char piles, and they germinated beautifully. So this is
And just so
stacked
everyone
benefits.
And just so everyone understands, there's high-tech versions of creating biochar, very uniform biochar, but there's also you manufacture very low-cost kilns that are collapsible and can be put in the back of a Subaru.
I mean, I could show the pictures now if you want to see them, if this is the right time.
Let me check in with Stephen, because I know we're over schedule for this
That's fine.
first part.
I've got a lot of stuff on my website, and I do want to mention I have a book. It's called the Biochar Handbook. It's published by Chelsea Green. It just came out last summer, And it's all this stuff is in there. So if anybody wants to get that book, it's on your online booksellers, the Biochar Handbook.
And one of the things you mentioned that I love is that this isn't something that gets scaled up, because you scale things up and you're like having more of an impact a lot of times on the environment. This is something that spreads like a meme. So anyone who's listening to this, if you have some property or you're like involved in the forestry industry and pile burning is happening, there's an alternative to that that would do all the things that Kelpie's just explained.
We're also starting a group called Biochar On Site. So biocharonsite.org. We're starting an organization because we have a big network of people who are doing these practices now, and it's growing really fast right now. So check out that site. We're just getting started, but we're going to offer a lot of fact sheets and guidelines and how to and all of this.
Would you like to show us some slides to give us a better sense of what biochar is and how it works?
You bet. Here we go. So this is an excerpt from a 9-week course I just finished teaching at Regenerative Living Online, and it will be available as a self-paced course in a few weeks if anybody's interested in a super deep dive. It is just a few slides. And so just to explain to you what I'm really doing here. So there's different ways of making biochar. I make biochar in the woods on site in a technique called flame carbonization, which is a form of pyrolysis, which is the term for making charcoal. And so we make it in an open flame, and it's really simple because you just look at the stages of burning. Wood doesn't burn all at once, it burns in stages. The first stage is drying, where water vapor comes out mostly. And then as the wood is heated more and more, you lose the volatiles. So those are the hydrogen and oxygen containing compounds. And that's what burns in a flame. And if there is no flame present, it comes out as smoke. So a flame is just burning smoke. And then when you get to that stage of where the flame dies down and you have hot glowing coals, and everybody has seen this who's ever had a campfire, at the end of the night, the flames die down, you got the hot burning coals. If you just put it out with water, right then and there, you make biochar. So we're just interrupting the combustion process. And then if you look at it from the point of view of an individual log or a stick, we're basically burning away the outer part of the stick to get the heat to penetrate the center and make it into char. So it's very simple, and that's the process. So here's a typical way that I do this in the woods, just with burn piles. Here's just a bunch of small hand piles. We light them all on fire. We wait till it it's mostly, all the flame is gone, and we've got the heap of glowing coals. And if we do nothing, it'll just burn to ash and leave a burn scar. But we put it out with water, and we basically spray it and rake it thin. And if we can also do this in the rain. If it's a rainy day, we can just spread it out and the rain will put it out. Or if there's snow on the ground, so you don't always have to bring a water truck. You can sometimes do this with the moisture that's there. And then what we end up with is we make a lot of biochar. We'll turn about 10% of the material into char by weight. And so, if we're doing this in somebody's property where they're clearing fuels around their house, we'll take some to use in the landscaping and the gardens, and we'll leave some there. And here's an example of where we did some piles where we raked them out in the rain, and we made some char, but also some of it did burn to ash and make a burn scar. And we seeded native seeds, and you can see how we got germination where the char was and not where the rocks are. So it holds moisture and it helps plants germinate. This is the Ring of Fire kiln that I sell. This is what it looks like. It does this thing where it's a double ring, and the air comes up through the annular gap, and it helps to burn the smoke. So you can see that the smoke actually comes kind of back inside. This is a diagram that shows how that works. So you can make it in a burn pile, or you can make it in this kiln, or there's other kiln designs too. It's basically just a container. And I like this one because it really kind of sucks the smoke back in and burns the smoke. It's very clean. And at the end, again, to put it out, you just spray it with water and rake it thin to lose the heat. And we can make a couple of cubic yards of biochar in a few hours with this kiln. So there you go. That's my book. And that's all I have.
Mara, do we have some questions? I mean, I know we do because I'm reading them and they're really good questions.
Hmm. Yeah, very good. Yes, we do. So I sort of organize them in terms of some are just soils questions, and there seem to be a lot of questions about biochar. Um, let's see. One from Kelpie about mulch. Does mulch harm forest soil?
Well, I can say a few words about mulch. I think mulch has mixed effects. I'll start by relating how it relates to forest fires. And there was a study done in Fort McMurray, which suffered a tremendous fire a number of years ago in northern Alberta. And there were some neighborhoods where almost every house burnt and a couple didn't burn. And then there were neighborhoods where only a couple houses burned and everybody else survived. And the ones where a couple houses burned and the ones and most everything else didn't burn, the ones that were burned are the ones that had mulch. They basically had mulch running, say, from the driveway up to the house, or maybe along the sidewalk to keep the weeds down. And of course, an ember drops on that mulch when it's dry, it'll burn. And then it just creates a burn that goes right up to the house and burnt the house to the ground. So you want to think about where you put your mulch. Like it's combustible material when it's dry. Um, and we do what we call mastication as a fire treatment rather than creating those piles and burning them, like in what we saw in Kelpie's presentation there. Sometimes they have a big chipper and they just chip the stuff and blow it back onto the ground in the forest. And if it's put on in a shallow amount, it's probably not deleterious. And it's a good way to do it, particularly if you're concerned about smoke and the potential for fire spreading. But on the other hand, if it's mostly wood and it's put down quite thickly, it becomes fuel for the next fire as well. And also, if it's wood and not just small branches and leaves, it's very low in nitrogen. And if you ever put sawdust on your garden, that it is not a good idea because you got to go out and then buy a bag of high nitrogen fertilizer to make up for all the microbes moving into the sawdust and sucking all the nitrogen out of your garden. So, um, mulch is something that can be useful, but you got to be real careful how you put it and where you put it.
I'm going to move on to some biochar questions and start with a sort of general one about like what is the scale people are curious about. Can you make it in small quantities? Can it be big? There were questions about using biochar in the garden and burning, having small burn piles versus on a larger scale with forestry and slash piles and whatnot. Can you speak a little bit to that, Kelpie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I showed some pictures of the two techniques that I use. And, baking, you can sometimes we'll have 20 to 50 burn piles an acre. So
Mhm.
is that small scale or large scale, right? It's a small pile, but it's a large acreage. And we can make biochar in all those piles if we have the right equipment and the right crew to do that. Um, but you can also do that just one little pile at a time in your backyard for your garden. And it's just pretty simple. I mean, there are techniques to build piles that'll work better than, some piles don't burn very well. And one of the big advantages of doing making biochar in a burn pile, well, there's a few. One is we always keep a flame on top so that it burns hot and makes char quickly, but it also burns the smoke, so it's a cleaner way of burning than many people are used to. So proper burning technique can be really very clean. It's just the flame. You don't see a lot of smoke. And then we have water there to put it out at the end, so it's a lot safer. I see a lot of homeowners burning piles. They don't really know what they're doing. They make a slow, smoky, smoldering pile that is just a nuisance and takes a long time. And they could quickly make biochar if they knew what they were doing. So a lot of it's just what are we already doing? We're already burning stuff. Let's do it a little different way and make this biochar that we can either leave in the forest, because forests naturally have a certain amount of char in them, or harvest some and put it in our gardens and landscaping.
Great. Thank you. Do either of you have any idea about how commercial entities like forestry companies and governments might be encouraged to be engaged in some things like soil regenerating processes like biochar?
I can comment from the point of view of British Columbia, which the whole forestry situation in the United States is quite different in terms of tenure and who controls what. In British Columbia, most of it's crown land or public land, and the Forest Service governs what happens or doesn't happen. And what creates these slash piles is the government is very concerned about leaving slash in the bush and creating a fire hazard. So companies are forced, they have to, by law, bring that material onto a landing, and they create giant piles and they burn it. At the moment, there's no incentive nor any direction to create charcoal. It's to basically get rid of the fuel. But it certainly could be done. It's a matter of changing policy. And I think that, the government has an initiative to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And from the information that Kelpie has given, we're reducing anywhere from 50 to 70% of the CO2 given off in these slash piles. One could institute that as a process to do that. The reality is that it's going to cost money, and it'll need to be trained to the people who are building these piles. They're almost all built by excavators. They could easily be doing the kind of things that Kelpie is suggesting, but at the moment it's not required, so no one's doing it. The only additional cost is actually supplying the water that you need to put them out. Yeah.
If I could just follow up on
Yeah,
that,
please do.
there's something called an air curtain burner. And this is a big insulated box, about the size of a shipping container, that has an air blower. And so it really eliminates the smoke. And they were originally designed to incinerate to ash as just a disposal method. But there's different companies now have come up with some new designs that make biochar. There's one called the Tiger Cat, and there's a few of them here on the West Coast in the U.S. And there's one that's operating in California right now. Well, there's a few of them, but there's a company operating in California, and I'm working. One of my colleagues is working with them on a carbon accounting app. So, an application and a protocol. And the thing about biochar and carbon accounting is that it's so easy to do, because it's there it is. It's material. You can weigh it, you can measure it, and you can know pretty accurately how much carbon you actually removed. So for where there's opportunity, where entities want to pay for carbon removal, biochar is turning out to be probably the best way to do that, just because you can do the accounting. So that's happening in California and on the West Coast. Again, who's going to pay for it is the question.
Yeah, I think that's an issue, absolutely. And in many of our cases, getting machinery on site would be extremely expensive. But, as you've indicated in some of your other materials, that, if you build the piles properly and you can burn them in the open, you just need to be able to put them out at the right point in time. And most of our burning here is done in the fall or actually in the winter. So there's even more options, but you still have to somehow have the water there to put them out. Because we're talking, I guess you could spread the material with a backhoe into the snow, would be one possibility, I guess. Yeah, I think there's certainly opportunities for it to happen. There are some community forests like the Harrop Proctor here in the Nelson area. They might be the people to test it on, and they might be willing to do it actually.
They are
So
doing.
that's one option. Yeah.
Harrop Proctor, they actually are making biochar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to, so there are questions about gardening and soil, which types of soil and is biochar good for? And do you need to inoculate it first with compost and things like that? There's that side of it. And then there's also a question about like reclaiming or dealing with contaminated site restoration. And I know as well, I don't know if you know about this so much, Kelpie, but you probably do because you're the queen of biochar. But like mining reclamation and things like that. So there's the one part which is improving the soil for gardens and for gardeners and having that even potentially being a product that would be produced. And then on the other side would be reducing the harm and dealing with reclaiming some of the damage done to these sites through things like mining.
Sure. So, the thing about biochar, especially the biochar that we make in these flaming combustion processes, it's made at very high temperature. So it's really pretty much like activated charcoal that you would use in a filtration medium. And so it's very porous, it's very absorptive, it's got a lot of surface area, and there's electrostatic attraction on those surfaces. So it holds on to a lot of stuff. So let me take the garden first, because the best way I think to use biochar is to use it to manage other organic waste streams. So don't just mix it with compost, put it in at the beginning of the composting process. So whatever you have and everybody has food waste. So I do this with my food waste from the kitchen. I put it in a bucket with biochar. I put a little lactobacillus in there too, and as an inoculant to acidify it, because biochar is a little alkaline. And it ferments my food waste. And then I put it in a outdoor compost pile, and it breaks down really quickly, and the biochar gets charged up with nutrients, and it gets activated with microbes. And then you have the most amazing compost you've ever used in your garden. So that's the key. And if you have animals, livestock, chickens, put it in their bedding. You can even feed it to them. Or see if they want to eat it. Free choice feed it. It can be really good for a lot of animals. So that's how I use it in the garden. And it doesn't have to be complicated at all. Just use it in your compost first, and then it'll be all ready to use in the garden. And so it's going to absorb and hold on to nutrients. Now, with the mining reclamation, that is a big use for biochar. In fact, all kinds of brown fields. People are using it now to remediate PFAS, the polyfluoro, whatever that all comes out to, but both organic contaminants, it'll hold on to them, and then it'll help microbes break that stuff down, those persistent organic pollutants. And then metals, for mine site reclamation, it can hold on to heavy metals. And it also, there's people working on doing mine reclamation in Oregon at Oregon State, where they have acid mine drainage from, I think it was a nickel mine. And what happens there is the alkalinity of the biochar and the porous nature of it deals with the extreme acidity and allows a different kind of microbial community to establish. So it can really, so there's lots of different ways that biochar can help, remediate soils that are contaminated by various kinds of pollutants.
Can one of you talk about the effect of forest fires on soil? And I'm really looking at like what is the difference between a low intensity fire on the effect on the soil versus a high intensity crown fire? Like what do you see?
And let me add to that also cultural burning, because that is
Mhm.
something that's developing, is getting back to traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous practices with the land, which would be more low intense burning. Have
Yeah, I
people-
think you can basically equate cultural burning with low intensity burning. They're trying to light up in the spring or late in the fall when you're not going to get a high intensity fire. They're not doing it when the fire index is at extreme. In terms of, yeah, there's a lot of difference between a low intensity fire and a high intensity fire. Crown fire just means that the fire is actually moving from tree to tree in the crown.
Mhm.
And generally what happens is fires start on the ground. Lightning strikes, sometimes they can start in the ground, but generally they start in the ground, and you have what you call ladder fuels, which are intermediate sized trees or trees that have branches right to the ground so that the fire can actually move from the ground into the crown. And then if you've got usually a substantial amount of wind, it'll continue. And if the trees are close enough spaced, it'll jump from tree to tree. And in fact, you have a fully engaged crown fire. And those are the kind where the firefighters close the truck and go home, because you do not fight those on the ground. And you can try and fight them from the air, but usually it's windy. And secondly, there's so much smoke that you can't use. And then you basically have a fire out of control, rank 5, rank 6 fire, where you just stay home and hope for the rain. A low intensity fire is where you don't have those ladder fuels, and the fire is constricted to staying on the ground. And so what it's just burning is the fuels that are on the ground, and it's not nearly as hot. Sometimes it'll just scorch the forest floor, and not, and often it's in grassland or shrubby type terrain. They move very fast, but they're not nearly as hot, and they don't last nearly as long. In terms of the intensity, in terms of effects on soil, some of the worst effects on soils aren't actually high intensity crown fires, but often fires that are burning at night and burning downslope or back burning, where they burn really slow and they fully consume everything on the ground. And I've seen areas where there is absolutely not a speck of organic matter left. The top layer of the soil in our forest soils here, it's the AE, that sort of whitish layer you get right underneath the forest floor, that is fully cooked, and in some cases actually melted into the surface. And those kind of fires will burn right into root systems. I've seen old growth forests where you can actually climb into where there was a stump and roots went into the ground. Those are the ones that are really nasty in terms of impacts on the soils. One of the more important impacts on soils are what we call hydrophobic soils, or where soils become water resistant. And if you get a high intensity fire, oftentimes you kind of cook that surface with organic compounds that are left on the surface of the soil, and the soils do not allow water to recharge into the soil for some time until that layer breaks down. And those are the ones that usually end up leading to serious erosion problems after a forest fire, because rather than the rainstorms soaking into the ground, they run off quickly, accumulate in gullies. I could show some photos from Kuskanook here in the Kootenays in 2003, where we had exactly that sequence, and a debris torrent came down, took out Highway 3 along the lake, took out a couple of houses. Same thing happened in Slocan Valley in 2008, I believe. There were similar situations, and those are something that's particularly more serious now with climate change. Essentially, the same kind of sequence occurred in California, where you have really, really intense rains followed by a really prolonged and dry drought. You get a series of fires. You had all that fuel built up because the high rains created productivity, and then the fires stop, and then you get high intensity rains on these soils that are hydrophobic, and then you get incredible landslides. And that's essentially the sequence we saw in Los Angeles in January. And the previous year was the dry period that built up to that. And then in February and March, we had very high rainstorms. And that's the new pattern. It's called climate volatility, that's developing as climate change progresses, or otherwise known as climate whiplash.
Thanks for joining us, Greg, Kelpie, and all our participants. We'll be back next month with another Resilience Cafe, in which we'll explore forest health.